Welcome to Dark Facade, a channel dedicated to looking past the veneer of humanity and finding its true face. I will be your tour guide down this winding path of tales, ranging from the supernatural, science fiction, and twisted love. All the stories you're about to hear are assorted bits of literature that will range from the bizarre to the unexpected. So sit back, lower the lights, and allow yourself to be taken away from everyday reality to its shadowy reflection. If you enjoy our unusual content, please be sure to hit the like and subscribe button to receive more. Thank you. The Book of Dark Names by Katie Rogers, read by Katie Rogers, Chapter 13. The day of Evelyn's funeral was as somber as one could expect. The skies of St. Louis were cloudy and gray. It was as if heaven itself was mourning her loss. The urn which held her remains served as a painful beacon that she was gone. The huge picture of her that was displayed beside it only emphasized the fact that this was all that remained of a beautiful life. Christopher sat quietly along with all the other mourners. Sean, Laura, Richard, and Daniel surrounded him in the pew. He didn't have to be a psychic to feel the pain that was radiating off the defense attorney. He was not just suffering the loss of a dear friend. His wife had been taken by something evil, and her fate was unknown. This was a weight no husband should bear. The two men sat side by side, locked in grief. After Evelyn's adopted brother finished his eulogy, their family preacher came back up to offer some final thoughts of comfort. He began with reiterating her brother's sentiments before going into a montage about her soul finding its way back to God. As the minister moved further on into his heavenly spiel, her final words echoed darkly in Christopher's mind. You were right. There is nothing. Never had a victory been so hollow for him, and never had he wanted to be proven wrong more than at this moment. When he could take no more of the preacher's nonsense, he jumped to his feet. To the dismay of everyone assembled, he began to rage against the man at the pulpit. God? Where the hell was God when she was being killed? Where was his infinite wisdom and mercy when Evelyn was taken out by something dark and by his standards unholy? Tell me, preacher, tell us all how killing someone as pure and beautiful as she was fit into his fucked up plan, because frankly, I just don't get it. The only sound that could be heard throughout the stunned chapel was his retreating footsteps. Somehow his grief had become rage, but he didn't care. Anger, sadness, what was the difference? They were both painful. He passed through the front entryway and continued from there until he reached a small prayer garden off to the side. There were several concrete benches along the path. He picked the one closest to a fountain and sat down. That outburst he had just displayed was completely out of character for him. He hated losing control of his emotions. No one knew it more than Evelyn. Ironically, no one brought that side of him out more than she did. The sound of gunfire in the distance unnerved him. Since their last dreadful encounter with Kadaf, the world had become a much more violent place. The gaps in humanity had broadened considerably, disposing mankind to their darker side. Tempers ran hot, giving way to violence. Greed was unchecked, and cruelty was becoming the norm. Within a few days' time, the human race was on a fast track to hell on earth, courtesy of a being that many of them would dismiss as nonsense. In truth, he would have been one of those people if he had not seen Kadaf for himself. Apparently, the devil was real. He had just been kept at bay for a while, and now he was free to roam among them and feed upon the carcass of their vice. He'd become so consumed with the pressing matter of humanity's fate, he did not hear Rachel, Evelyn's adoptive mother, come up from behind. Christopher? He jumped at the sound of her voice, but quickly recovered when he turned to face her. When he had first met Mrs. Gray, she was quite a formidable woman. She was intelligent, strong-willed, and equally passionate in her convictions as he was. The dynamic of their personalities should have made them clash, but it didn't. There was a quiet appreciation between the two of them, and of course the bridge that brought them to a common place. Evelyn. A twinge of sadness seeped into his gaze as he beheld Rachel now. Time had been brutal to her. This once towering personality was now a weak figure confined to a wheelchair due to her failing heart. An oxygen tank was hooked onto the back. Joseph, her son, handed her the air mask and told her to put it on. Reluctantly, she obeyed him and placed it over her nose and mouth. The two shared a look suggesting that she had upheld her end and now he needed to do the same. After giving Christopher a sympathetic grin, he leaned down and kissed his mother's cheek before leaving the garden. "Come sit with an old woman," she said as she slid the mask off. "Should you be doing that?" he asked, concerned. "I already have 2 fussy children. I don't need another," she snapped. He chuckled softly as a trace of the woman he remembered emerged. "I want to apologize for my outburst back there. I didn't mean to make a bad day worse," he said regretfully. "You don't need to explain a thing. I do understand how you feel. My Evie, she was a beautiful soul. I loved her just as much as if I'd given birth to her." The sudden rush of grief forced Rachel to take another hit from her mask. "You okay?" Christopher inquired while squeezing her hand. She nodded. "There are 2 reasons I want to speak with you, Christopher. The first was this. It belonged to Evelyn, and I know she'd want you to have it." She pulled what looked to be a journal of some kind from her handbag. It was made from leather and had the figure of a dog, a Labrador, carved into it. He smiled when he saw it. The canine resembled Evelyn's childhood pet, Sarah. He had come home with her one summer and met the yellow lab that had been her closest companion while growing up. At that point, the dog was in its early senior years, but she was still spry. Sarah's sudden death later that fall crushed Evelyn to pieces. He remembered staying with her that night in her dorm, calmly holding her until she cried herself to sleep. "Open the book, Christopher. Look inside," Rachel coaxed gently. He flipped through the pages and smiled at some of the good memories they evoked. Pictures of the 2 of them together on campus, at his family's beach house, and on the lake the summer he had come home with her, gave him a much-needed boost. As he perused on, he saw something more revealing. Newspaper clippings of interviews he had given about books he had written, college announcements about his speaking engagements, and articles from magazines about him were all pasted inside. She'd been keeping track of him all this time. He looked back at Rachel, who simply nodded at his mournful gaze. "That's right, Christopher. She never stopped loving you. I will admit I tried to get her to move on, to find someone else to make her happy, but she couldn't. Part of me believes she just wouldn't." "Why do you say that?" he said in a voice heavy with sadness. "Because you proved to be the only one who could penetrate the darkness and make her feel safe," Rachel replied. "Didn't do such a good job in the end, did I?" "The darkness got her," he said bitterly. Rachel cupped his chin in her withered hand before tilting his head up to look her in the eye. "That thing, that menace, may have won this round, but it's no match for you. It's no match for any of you." She was speaking not only with the ferocity of a grief-stricken mother, but as someone who had to fight many battles of her own with the dark. Christopher was wrestling with defeat. This was a feeling he rarely suffered, and yet, for the past few years, he'd come to know it well. He had lost his marriage, his family, and the respect of his peers. Defeat seemed to be on a mission to crush him, and after Evelyn's death, he was almost willing to surrender. "Evelyn never told you how she came to live with me, did she?" Rachel asked, attempting to pull him away from his despair. "No, she didn't," he replied. "Well, as you know, I knew almost from the start Evelyn did not belong at Ashbury. She was different, there was no doubting that, but different doesn't warrant being locked up. After a couple of weeks, she proved to me that her ability to hear the walls was real. How? Christopher shrugged with interest. Several years ago, before Evelyn came to the asylum, we had a new patient come in named Charles Jordan. Charles Jordan. Why do I know that name? Christopher murmured. You know him as the butcher of Watson Road. He used to kidnap people, carve them up in his basement, and serve them to his guests. He was a real sick ticket. Anyway, if anyone belonged at Ashbury, he did, Rachel declared before sucking down more air from the mask. So what happened? Two of his victims was a mother and daughter, Miley and Amy Perkins. They were the sister and niece to one of the nurses that worked there. The day we found out he had copped an insanity plea and was given life in Ashbury, the nurses on my ward all made a pact. If the courts would not end him, we would. I drew the short straw, so I gave the overdose and planted the pills under his mattress so it would look like a suicide. That was my dark deed that the walls of Ashbury bore witness to and later told Evelyn. Christopher stared at her with a mixture of emotions. He tried not to judge her, but part of him couldn't help it. Rachel just shook her head and smiled. I suppose it's only natural for you to be horrified by what I've told you. But you see, people like Jordan, those that we casually label psychotic and lock away, they're the dark. They're made of it. You know those old cliches, a leopard can't change its spots, you can't save a sinking ship? That's what psychotics are. They can't change because they don't know remorse. Suddenly, Rachel's battle with the dark became clear. She had seen society's worst, and those like Evelyn that they simply threw away. The day Charles Jordan had come under her care, she chose to throw him away and keep Evelyn. Some might say it was not her place to decide, but when you come face to face with the dark, sometimes, just sometimes, the answer reveals itself. On some level, Christopher had to admit her sin was understandable. So Evelyn told your dark secret to you. That's what convinced you she was telling the truth, he said, attempting to move on from her confession. Yes, and I wasn't the only one she convinced either, Rachel sighed forebodingly. Who else? He asked, as he subconsciously leaned in closer. Dr. Reagan Kent. He was her assigned shrink, and that's exactly what he was. A head shrinker, not a doctor. He had no business in the profession. He was useless at best, and a sadist the rest of the time. Evelyn's fear of the dark started when she was very small. Her parents used to lock her in a closet whenever she would start telling them what the walls were saying. They told her that the dark would take her if she didn't start being good and stop with her stories. Kent later used this trauma from her past to manipulate her into revealing secrets about his colleagues and the staff. He later used these secrets to his advantage. He locked her up. Christopher's voice was filled with disgust. Yes, he'd leave her in there sometimes for hours. He would promise to let her out if she would be good and cooperate with him. Any hope she had of beating this demon went away the day he became her doctor. How was he able to do this? Didn't any of you report him? Christopher demanded in outrage. Of course. But we were nurses, working in a state-funded mental asylum under doctors who were owned by Kent because he knew all their dirty secrets. One tortured little girl was a small price to pay to keep out of jail or disgrace. I knew if any of this was going to stop, I'd have to find a way myself, and I did. The bitter resolve in the old woman's voice forced her to take another deep breath from her mask before continuing. I figured that if Kent knew everyone else's secrets, it was time we knew some of his. Rats like him, they always have more than their share. We may not have been able to get him for what he was doing to Evelyn, but There had to be something. Sure enough, there was. What was it? Christopher asked, almost salivating to hear. The walls told Evelyn about a secret safe that the good doctor had hidden in the back of the very closet he locked her in. I thought there might be something in that vault that we could use. The thing was, Evelyn would have to endure the dark to get it. I felt like a monster trying to convince this frightened child to face her demons when she was still so scared of them. I told her to let the dark take her this time. Let it take her so she could be free. Rachel's voice cracked with a mixture of shame and anguish. So what was in the safe? Christopher murmured, while taking hold of the old woman's shaking hand to calm her. All the documentation we would need to put him and all those doctors he was blackmailing away for a very long time. I figured if they weren't going to stick their necks out to save her, I sure as shit wasn't going to spare them. What did they do? Everything from writing bogus prescriptions for drugs to sell to illegal human experimentation. Thanks to Evelyn, we knew right where to get the evidence. The sweetest part of it all was his little black ledger that he used to keep track of the money and favors he demanded for his silence. It was sitting on top of the stack like a beautiful boulder I would use to sink him. The satisfaction in Rachel's voice was mirrored in Christopher's eyes. He then asked her how Evelyn was able to leave Ashbury. Shortly after all the arrests and convictions, the new administrator gladly released Evelyn to my care, and I petitioned to adopt her. The rest was history, she smiled. Christopher sat quietly, letting all the secrets that Rachel just revealed sink in. He had faced adversity of his own growing up. His extreme intelligence had enabled him to skip grades, but it came with a price of few friends and often isolation. Even though he was much younger than some of his classmates, he remained the smartest kid in the class. This, combined with his equally smart mouth, opened him up to bullying. He remembered one day 3 boys from his 7th grade science class jumped him after school. The 2 of them held him down while their leader, Brad Knoll, pounded him to a pulp. After Kaylee got a look at him when he got home that day, he was homeschooled from then on. He had suffered at the hands of bullies, but it was nothing compared to what Evelyn had gone through. She was hurt and discarded by the 2 people who should have loved her most. She was chased away by her community and tortured by someone who was supposed to help her. Evelyn was so much stronger than he ever knew, so much braver than he ever realized. Although he was not sure why Rachel had shared this with him now, he was thankful she had. It made him miss Evelyn more, but he knew her better. "What are you thinking about now?" Rachel asked, drawing him back to the present. "About how much I'm going to miss her," he answered sadly. "Yes, we all will, but I don't think I'll have to miss her for very long." Christopher watched as she took another hit from her mask. He shook his head and smiled at her stubbornness. Rachel gave orders. She didn't follow them. Joseph returned to his mother's side as if on cue. He gently placed the mask back over her face and shared a mutual grin with Christopher when she fussed. The scientist got to his feet as her son turned around to wheel her away. "Thank you, Mrs. Gray, for everything," he said softly. "Not at all, Christopher," she replied. As he walked down the path, she called after him. He turned one last time to see what she wanted. "Don't be angry when I don't let you stay. It won't be because I don't like you. It's just, it won't be your time." Joseph stared back at him in confusion with a shrug. Christopher decided to dismiss the old woman's cryptic message as one of disorientation. He nodded politely before walking away. On the car ride back to his hotel, he began to read more of Evelyn's journal. It was bittersweet, but it was, in its own way, a comfort. The driver announced that they had arrived at their destination. Christopher thanked him before exiting the limo and going upstairs. When he entered his suite, he was surprised to see all of the group had assembled in the living room. From the looks on their faces, they had been waiting for a while. Daniel, who was sitting behind the desk in front of a large window, scowled at him while clutching one of the grimoires. "What's all this?" he asked nervously. "Sit down, Harris. We need to talk," Daniel ordered.